The tariffs that President Donald Trump imposed on most countries around the world on April 2nd shook the global economy. Stock markets plunged, the dollar declined, and the price of oil dropped to a 4-year low. A week later, Trump suspended the so-called reciprocal tariffs on most countries, causing stock markets to rebound. But the tariffs he kept in place are still more dramatic than anything the world has seen in decades, and China and the United States are now in a full-blown trade war. Most mainstream economists believe that free trade, not tariffs, is the best way to increase global prosperity. But Trump has long felt that other countries are taking advantage of the United States and that tariffs can bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Welcome to Counterpoint, a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Each week, we look at one pressing question facing world leaders from two opposing points of view. I'm Sasha Polako-Saransky. This week, we're featuring a debate between two economists who feel very differently about tariffs. It was moderated by Foreign Policy's editor-in-chief, Ravi Agrawal, and it aired on our flagship podcast, Foreign Policy Live. Arguing in favor of tariffs is Oren Cass, the founder and chief economist of American Compass, a conservative economic think tank. Cass is not representing the Trump administration, but he is seen as a leading voice articulating the economic agenda of the new right. Arguing against tariffs is Kimberly Clausing, an economist and professor at UCLA. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the nonpartisan Peterson Institute for International Economics. And let me just point out that the debate was conducted before Trump suspended the reciprocal tariffs for 90 days. He's hoping to get trade concessions from countries in exchange for the suspension. If he doesn't, they're still in play. Okay, we're going to let Ravi take it from here.
Okay, so a lot has been written and said about Trump's tariffs so far. And let me be clear, most economists have panned them as a self-imposed disaster. So here's what I want to do. Before we debate specific points, I want to get both our panelists to reflect on Trump's April 2nd tariffs. Kim, let me start with you. Why do you think this was a bad idea?
This is the single most self-destructive economic policy move I've seen in my lifetime. And I think there's kind of three elements to why it's such a terrible idea. One, it's a very large consumer tax increase. Recent calculations have suggested the neighborhood of $3,800 of additional costs for the typical household. This is going to more than dwarf any possible tax cut coming out of the budget process. And it's a regressive tax. It falls disproportionately on those lower in the income distribution. Second, it's terrible for U.S. production. One thing we should remember is our exporters are our largest importers. Production these days often crosses borders, and it crosses borders many times. So what we're doing is we're disadvantaging U.S. production by making our firms pay much more for any input than their competitors would abroad. And that's before we even get to the retaliation. And the third problem is the really shambolic and misguided way that they implemented this. Even if you wanted to have tariffs for whatever reason, you thought some industries were strategic or you wanted to de-risk from China, these tariffs are on every country in the world, and they're calculated based in a way that really makes no sense at all. What the administration did is calculate the bilateral trade deficit and use that as a proxy for protectionism. But that really is a useless proxy for protectionism. And we can see that with many examples. But one example is we're levying a huge tariff on Korea, and they're our free trade area partner. They don't have big barriers against our products, but yet they're going to be facing this giant tariff. So this is a really dysfunctional and poorly executed articulation of an idea that was already a terrible idea.
Thanks, Kim. So I have to say, this is pretty much a mainstream consensus view from Kim. And you pick up your newspaper of choice and you will read editorials, arguments, pieces, essentially outlining a version of what we just heard there. Oren, you have been making the case for Trump's tariffs. And I know you don't agree with every single thing he said, every single thing in the April 2nd announcement. But in the main, what is the case for Trump's tariffs?
Well, I think it's really important to distinguish between the sort of conceptual argument for tariffs and the specifics here, because, the reality is that even if the Trump team had developed the sort of most carefully thought out, thorough well communicated set of tariffs, a lot of economists would sort of just be saying essentially many of the same things because they see tariffs as kind of per se invalid. And I don't agree with that. I think tariffs can and probably need to play an important role in our policy. And so my guess is we'll come back to discuss that a bit further. With respect to the Trump tariffs, as he's announced them, I would treat them essentially in three buckets. It seems to me one element is the global 10% tariff. That's a policy that we've been very supportive at American Compass. I think it's a useful one. And, I think ideally it's something that gets made permanent and gets made permanent through legislation. And that would provide, certainly at a 10% level, it would be disruptive, but not fatally so. And if established as a stable part of our economic policy, I think could actually do a lot of good. The second piece is the focus on China. I think our goal should be to be decoupling from China. I don't think it works to have free trade with an authoritarian, communist, state-controlled economy. And, there's bipartisan legislation in Congress to revoke permanent normal trade relations and even push tariffs as high as 100%. But it phases them in. And I think, phasing in at 20% a year, let's say, Trump had already done 20, say there's going to be another 20 next year, another 20 the year after that, I think could be quite worthwhile, especially if commitments are secured from allies to do the same. The third piece is the reciprocal tariffs, which I think Kim rightly focused on, because I think there's, for one thing, just been a lot of confusion over what they actually are, how they're calculated, what their purpose is, and what we're actually asking allies to do. I think if you're going to sort of threaten or in fact impose some consequence and demand different action, you need to be really clear on what the problem is and what you're expecting to see. And I don't think the Trump administration has made that case, certainly not at the point where you would want those sorts of tariffs to snap in day one. So, I do think it'd be very reasonable for the administration, for the United States, to be telling some of these allies that have run long-term systemic trade imbalances with us, and frankly, I would absolutely include Korea on that list. Look, you are making policy choices that are affecting this. We would like to change what is in your interest, so you make different policy choices. I think that's very reasonable. That's something Reagan did to great effect with the Japanese. But I think the way that gets done would have to be different than what we've seen so far.
So I want to start parsing through some of these issues individually, but Kim, if I can come to you for a minute there. Oren began by saying that a lot of economists instinctively disagree with tariffs as a policy. And is that true? I mean, are there aspects of tariffing that you think could be useful for the United States to deploy?
So there are certainly several cases where economists would agree that a tariff might be called for. One is national security. We don't necessarily want free trade with our adversaries, and we want to make sure that we have domestic control over vital national security supply chains. Another is in response to unfair trading practices, when they truly are unfair trading practices. There's a process that we can go through that would enhance the rules-based international trading system. And having rules has really led to a lot of important gains for the whole world economy when we can come together in certain forums and agree on what's a reasonable trade barrier and what's not, right? So I think those areas are ones where one could imagine exceptional uses of tariffs. I think what we're seeing today is very, very, very different from that. These are tariffs as fiscal policy, including that broad one of the 10% tariff. A 10% tariff on everybody is still distortionary, right? And creates a lot of costs to the economy, reorienting production towards things that we would ordinarily be able to import for less and away from things that we're good at, our export industries. So there's downsides to using it that broadly. And then in these reciprocal tariffs, I think also have a very misguided root, which is this obsession with bilateral trade deficits. There's no reason to fetishize a bilateral trade deficit. Take, for instance, the case of Madagascar. They produce very simple textiles. They produce vanilla. And we're now tariffing them at 47%. It's an extremely poor country. That bilateral trade deficit reflects the fact that we want some vanilla and we want some inexpensive textiles, and they're a poor country that can't afford a lot of our things. So we're now punishing them with really high tariffs because they have a natural comparative advantage that makes it suitable for them to export to us. I think that that's just a deeply wrong-headed way to do it. And another way is to sort of flip it and say, well, which countries do we have surpluses with? We have surpluses with Brazil, Peru, Australia. 2 of those countries we have a free trade agreement with. Do we think the US is doing something wrong in those instances? Would we be okay with them reciprocating? And I say that in quotes because this is not a reciprocity. It's not a true reciprocity. Would we be okay with them tariffing us because we happen to produce things that they like more than the other way around, right? So that strikes me as just a deeply misguided way to implement this notion as well.
Well, as a lover of vanilla ice
Ravi,
cream, I'll say that all of that resonates. Oren, I know you want to jump in there, but what I wanted to do, and you can work in to the answer the things you want to as well, but for this to be the good faith debate I want it to be, I'm wondering if for a minute you can also address the things that you think in the implementation of the last week that have gone wrong. I mean, surely you don't agree with every single thing that the Trump administration has done on this issue.
No, absolutely. And I think, there are maybe 3 things I would highlight as broad thematic points. One is, I think, the question of immediate implementation versus phase-ins. I think it's really important to be credible and have people believe you are going to do the things you say you're going to do. But once you're over that threshold, I think phasing tariffs in, especially if they're going to be high ones, makes all the sense in the world. What you're trying to do is change the incentives in markets, but it's going to take time, obviously, for markets to adjust. And so if it's going to take a few years to actually shift supply chains, to move production into the United States, then you'd want people to believe, okay, within a reasonable amount of time that we could move, this is going to happen. So we should move as fast as we can. But beyond that, just doing everything immediately hits people with a lot of costs that bear no relationship to getting anybody to move faster. And also potentially just creates a lot of disruption if people don't have an opportunity to sort of get their houses in order. And so I think that kind of increase in cost is a real problem. I think the flip side is that you really do need sort of certainty and stability if you want people to change their behavior. And so on the benefit side, if we actually want people to start moving in response, they need to understand what is going to be the case 3 years from now, not just 3 weeks from now. And so certainly a lot of work to do there, both in how the administration has proceeded and ideally in working with Congress to actually legislate something that is intended to be permanent. Third, just briefly, I would add, I think communicating the actual goal and vision and expectation needs to be done better. Is the idea that you want a free trading bloc? Is the goal that China has to be kept out of it? Do you actually want bilateral balance everywhere? Or are you using that as a starting point for negotiation when the goal is just relatively more balanced trade within a bloc? If people don't actually know what you're getting at, it's, again, beyond just the certainty, it's very hard to forecast what they should be doing, where they should be headed. So, those are definitely places where I think ideally the approach would change, and where there is, by the way, still room to correct course. The only thing I wanted to pick up on more on the kind of philosophical side is I was, I guess, encouraged by, but maybe a bit skeptical of the second item on Kim's list, that economists would say tariffs are potentially appropriate and useful where other countries are behaving unfairly. The kind of standard statement of this is, from Paul Krugman, who famously said the economist's case for free trade is essentially a unilateral case. A country serves its own interests by pursuing free trade regardless of what other countries may do. I constantly see other economists sort of quoting that, playing it back. It has been argued to me quite directly, and it's at the core of what I think is so misguided. So I would love to hear that economists are shifting on that point. But if we have time to get to it, I just kind of be very curious whether Kim thinks that is still where most economists are, or whether we are now at the point where people realize the case for free trade can't just be unilateral.
Well, since you bring it up, Kim, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. I think most economists would be okay with the kinds of challenges to free trade that are brought under WTO cases, as an example, right? So you can see countries complaining about each other's subsidies that may be unfair, or complaining about particular elements. And the reason the WTO is such a useful institution historically is because countries can also work together in these cases. You know, a group of countries can say, hey, we don't think what China's doing in this particular market is fair. And in fact, China will have a better reason to respond if it's not just being picked on by one country, but there's a sort of a global consensus that they're violating a rule. I don't see the Trumpian utilization of this concept as being faithful to it at all, right? They seem to think all sorts of things are unfair that have nothing to do with unfairness. Like if a country has a different tax system than we do, that doesn't mean that's a trade barrier or that it's causing an unfair tilt in the playing field. And that's one example of things that they have said are unfair. I don't think a deficit indicates unfairness. And you can see many of the countries that we have deficits with have nearly free trade with us, right? So often we're complaining about things like deficits when we should really kind of be looking inside ourselves at what's causing that deficit. If you look at the US global deficit and how much we borrow from the rest of the world, which is sort of the flip side of the trade deficit, that's a result of the fact that we run really big fiscal deficits. And Congress right now is ready to add another $5 trillion over the next 10 years to our budget deficits. That's a big national source of borrowing, right? And in addition, our private sector doesn't save as much as it invests. And when you add those two things together, the only way to change the global US trade deficit is to change those fundamentals. And, you know, we have a tool that we could use that would be very direct and exactly to that point, and it's the budget process. Like we could start borrowing less tomorrow if Congress would be responsible and pass budget deficits that were at least smaller than the ones that they're doing. Instead, they're moving in the exact opposite direction. That would do more to right this macroeconomic imbalance that they seem to be worried about than tariffs. And tariffs might actually backfire, right? Tariffs could reduce our exports at the same time they're reducing our imports. We might get no improvement in this balance. So whether or not the balance is a good idea as something to target, they're certainly going about it in a very wrong-headed way.
Oren, if you can pick up there on the point about Congress's role, because it strikes me that the way in which these tariffs have been implemented using the provision IEEPA, a national security sort of clause here, and also bypassing Congress, which is meant to be the elected group that is able to control tariff policy. How do you square the strange implementation of that law and bypassing Congress here?
It's an important issue. I just briefly would say I agree with Kim entirely on the importance of the fiscal deficit. Getting that house in order is something that, you know, at American Compass, we are unfortunately a not widely joined voice on the right of center in focusing on, but it's absolutely a part of the problem. And getting these deficits down within the United States has to be part of the policy, in my view. That is one element of where Congress comes in. If Congress is, involved on the tariff side, for one thing, tariffs do raise a lot of revenue, but you have to have a stable, permanent plan in place if you want to really take credit for that. I think more broadly, this is just sort of the latest step in a decades-long pattern of power and policymaking shifting out of Congress and into an administration. And we're seeing the costs of that instability increasing in all sorts of areas. I mean, a different context, but not entirely unrelated, is the immigration context, where you have a Congress that doesn't act, and therefore one administration that pursues an extraordinarily lax, and I would even say kind of lawless policy on immigration to one extreme. And then the next administration comes in and responds by pushing all the way to the other side. Ideally, that would be in Congress's basket as well. And so on these tariff questions, especially given how important the sort of certainty and stability is to actually achieving the kind of change we want to see, I think it would be incredibly important for Congress certainly be supportive and read into the plan and on board in some respects, but ideally to actually be acting. And I think I mentioned there is legislation It's really interesting. It's a conservative Democrat, Jared Golden, has introduced the legislation several months ago now on a 10% global tariff. There's bipartisan legislation on revoking PNTR with China. It's not like these are things that Congress couldn't move on. And I think moving on them through Congress would frankly put things on a better timeline if it was, look, we want to see what we can get done on this year, and would have much higher benefits if we were actually able to get something across the finish line.
So I'm sensing a little bit of agreement here, which is not what I expected, but moving into some areas where I expect you will disagree some more. Kim, let's talk a little bit about inflation, because Trump, by some accounts, one of the reasons why he won was because of general frustration about higher prices and inflation. And Yale's Budget Lab, and I know the Peterson Institute as well, they've made pretty clear that these tariffs represent a regressive tax. In other words, if prices of regular goods rise, then lower income families will disproportionately suffer. Talk to us a little bit about how you're seeing the inflationary sort of aspect of these tariffs play out, and over what time frame.
Yeah, so I think there's already upward pressure on prices from these policies, and that upward pressure comes in part from anticipation. Like if I'm expecting tariffs to come and I'm a lumber yard, I might want to pre-order my lumber and make sure that I've got some in stock, right? But if there's the same amount of supply and demand starts to rise, you see upward pressure on prices already. Most economists, myself included, think that these tariffs will lead to a one-time jump in the price level as opposed to ongoing inflationary pressure. But one thing to bear in mind is that that jump is going to be very significant and large. It's not going to go unnoticed by households, right? If you're levying a tax increase of $3,800 on a median family each year, they're going to notice when they go to the store that things are more expensive. And here's an area where I'm sure Oren and I disagree, which is I'm not sure this is in fact, I'm sure this is not a good source of fiscal revenue. If you look around the world, most rich countries don't rely on tariffs to raise revenue. It's not that they're all making a mistake and there's some beautiful tariff policy that could get them really easy revenues. It's that they realize that tariffs are a uniquely bad way to raise revenue because they're both distortionary and regressive. So if you take the regressive part first, poor consumers and middle income people tend to spend all of their income every paycheck, right? So they're going out and buying things with their income every paycheck, and that causes the tariff to burden them directly. If you're a richer household and you may be saving half your income, buying some kids' tuition, going on some trips, a lot of those don't get burdened by tariffs, right? And so the share of the burden that you're feeling as a share of your income is much smaller. And that's what our analysis has suggested. And that's what other sources find too. So this is a source of revenue that's hurting the very same people that, were upset by the inflation. And the distortion is important here too, right? We can't produce everything in the United States. I'm not sure people want to sew their own clothing. I'm not sure they want to make vanilla. I don't think we need hothouse coffee made when we could have imported it more inexpensively from abroad. So this sort of slapdash attempt to produce everything here, right, is going to fundamentally just disrupt supply chains and create unemployment and new labor shocks, right? And so I think I agree that if you're introducing a shock, you should do it slowly. But there is also this question of why introduce this shock at all? There's many better ways to raise revenue, including a value-added tax, including just letting the Trump tax cuts expire, which wouldn't cause that big of a fiscal burden, but would really help right the ship. And I think there's, a bunch of other ideas too for tax reform that could be far more efficient than what we're seeing here.
You're listening to Counterpoint. This debate was moderated by Foreign Policy's editor-in-chief, Ravi Agrawal, and aired on the podcast Foreign Policy Live. We'll be right back with the rest of the debate.
Oren, so I'm going to have to ask you to try and respond to that. So it's a regressive tax in effect. It is going to hurt regular people when it comes to inflation. America doesn't want or need to make everything. It cannot make everything. So how do you square all of that?
Well, let me try to separate the fiscal question from what I kind of call the substantive question. Because I think it's important to say, I don't think tariffs are kind of an ideal tax base, right? Like, let's say we didn't care about trade at all. I wouldn't say, oh, well, let's try a bunch of tariffs. This is a point I always make about carbon taxes. We should acknowledge carbon taxes have costs, because if no one cared about climate change, if it wasn't a thing, no one would be saying, oh, well, let's use carbon as our tax base. It's not a sort of standalone best fiscal policy. I do think it's important to recognize the revenue as a benefit that tariffs do provide, though, because if you don't, I think you tend to get some very skewed analyses that essentially treat the money as sort of set on fire. That is, let's say that the US does collect $1 trillion of tariff revenue. Yes, that is coming out of the pockets of whoever has to pay it. And I certainly acknowledge that consumers pay a part of it. I'm sometimes puzzled when economists sort of throw their incidence analyses out the window and just assert that consumers pay all of it. But regardless, there are costs associated here, but the gross cost is not the net cost. If you take that revenue and use it to reduce the deficit, that has obviously real economic value. If you take that revenue and use it to reduce other taxes, maybe you'd say you're shifting to a less efficient tax base, but the cost is that shift in base, not the gross cost of the tariff. If you use it to fund really important investments, if you use it to benefit people in other ways, again, you have imposed a cost, but you've also provided a benefit. So it's not that revenue, in my mind anyways, the reason to impose a tariff, but it is an element of the equation that I think it's important not to overlook. And so what that then gets to is the question of the substantive side. Is this something that has benefits that exceeds the cost, bearing in mind that you do get that revenue? And that's obviously where Kim and I probably just most strongly disagree, and comes down in part even to this question of, do we think that making things matters? Certainly, I'm not calling for autarky and making everything ourselves. I would love to see high levels of balanced trade. And by the way, you only get revenue if trade is still happening, obviously. But I do think that the sort of reindustrialization of the United States, rebuilding our industrial base, should be an important priority. This is something essentially that we recognize has a lot of value beyond what private actors are going to take into account. And so public policy is going to have to play a role. And so I think it's best to analyze it then as kind of a two-step question. One, can we at least agree that making things matter and that reindustrialization is an important policy goal? Because if not, then obviously we're going to disagree on tariffs, but the disagreement isn't even going to be about the tariffs. And so there are people who don't want to reindustrialize or don't think it's important. Michael Strain at AEI, says we should not want to be a manufacturing power. And so that is a really interesting disagreement that has nothing to do with tariffs. If we agree on the goal, then there's the question of, do tariffs play an important role in achieving it? And certainly I think Kim and I will disagree there. One thing I would say is I don't think tariffs solve it alone. I think you obviously need to be doing a lot of other things as well. But I do think that if you want actors in the market to take into account that we have a preference for domestic production, then intervention that in fact shifts prices to prefer domestic production is an important element in that strategy.
Kim, I want you to respond to some of that. I don't think you were saying that manufacturing does not matter, but I'm curious about your take on how much it matters and where it fits in versus services. Because, of course, while the United States has net deficits on goods, it does not. It has a surplus on services. And that has been strangely missing from discussions over the past week and certainly on April 2nd.
Yes, so I think there's been an over-fetishization of manufacturing, and that doesn't mean that there aren't industries where it's important to have your own production. I would agree with that part. I think defense is an excellent example. I think there might be other industries we view as strategic. We saw the investments in the chips industry, which the Trump administration has already called a mistake, but investments in green energy, we might think that's an important industry to invest in. And so when you find those strategic industries that you want to encourage and nurture, there are good ways to do that. You can subsidize them, for instance, right? It gives them an incentive directly, and they still have to meet the test of world markets. So you're not creating this isolationist separate industry that's protected by trade barriers and that will never meet the test of world markets. I think they tried that in several Latin American countries. And when you put up really high tariffs to protect your domestic industry, it's never really going to thrive on the world markets because it's going to be dependent on this insulating buffer between it and the world market. I also think that, there's some valid goals in terms of thinking about how we address income inequality in this country. And some people have said tariffs are a good way to do that. I disagree because simply tariffs are going to fall disproportionately on those at the bottom end of the income distribution. So if we're worried about left behind communities and deindustrialization, I think we have a lot better tools. We invest in infrastructure, we invest in subsidies for industries we think are strategic for whatever reason. And we deal with income inequality through a progressive tax system, a stronger safety net, and investments in people like community college and infrastructure that can help make workers more productive. Those are all really direct, time-tested ways to make Americans more prosperous, as opposed to giving them a really high tax, a really disruptive shock, and falling asset values that cut into everybody's retirement accounts. I mean, look at how much savings we've all lost over the last few days. That's a market verdict just telling us that tariffs are not going to make the United States more prosperous.
Oren, just staying on the manufacturing issue, I have many questions coming in from subscribers, and I'm going to put a couple to you and see how you react. One is from Quentin Buckholtz, who says, how can remedying the trade deficit be expected to revitalize manufacturing when all major economies face broad, multi-decade downward trends in manufacturing employment, including in countries which run persistent trade surpluses like Germany and even China? Add to that, Simon Jaroslaw has a question on the same thing and says, if tariffs brought about reshoring of domestic manufacturing, and Simon is very skeptical about that, where would the labor for all of these factories come from? After all, the United States is at full employment and doesn't exactly have a surplus of skilled factory workers. Your thoughts, Oren?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question that goes to kind of what is the future state vision here? What does it actually look like to reindustrialize? Because it is certainly true that across all developed countries, including the United States, manufacturing employment as a share of employment, manufacturing as a share of GDP, would fall. And that's fine and entirely natural and was happening during the periods when the United States had an extraordinarily strong industrial base. What has changed in the US, and really only since about the year 2000, is that manufacturing essentially flatlined. Output just stopped growing at all. And so what that meant was that as we did continue to get productivity gains, those were directly traded off with declining employment. And it's really interesting to contrast that to prior periods. If you look back at the 1947 to 1972, 1972 to 2000, we were getting just as much productivity growth, essentially automating in the manufacturing sector just as quickly back then. But back then that led to growing output, right? If everybody could produce twice as much stuff, that was great. We produced twice as much stuff and everyone could be paid twice as much. And so even as the share of manufacturing declined, and in part because we were producing more prosperity, the number of manufacturing jobs held quite steady and the quality of those jobs continued to improve. It's only in this era of globalization where we've said, well, we still have huge growing demand for manufactured goods, but we're just not going to serve that growing demand domestically anymore. We are going to, on net, import it all. And what's that meant is that we've then seen an extraordinarily sharp decline in manufacturing employment. And so what I think we're trying to do when we talk about reindustrialization is just say, how do we get back closer to that trajectory we would have been on? If we have balanced trade, that would mean that at least our manufacturing sector was growing in proportion to what you would expect for a developed economy based on demand. And that would mean many, 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 millions more manufacturing jobs that indeed would be much more productive than they used to be and could pay much higher wages.
But Oren, are you saying that these manufacturing jobs are in some way more desirable than jobs in, say, services? I mean, why is it that that strikes you as a good outcome? Because some of this is also tied to one's perception of how the US economy is performing. And, inequality aside, on which tariffs could exacerbate, on most metrics, the American economy is doing remarkably well, especially compared to peers.
Well, I think it's certainly true that the U.S. economy has been at the top of a business cycle, but if you actually look over the long run at what has been happening in recent decades, the economic fortunes in terms of wage growth, in terms of sort of ability to obtain middle class security for a typical worker who still does not have a college degree, looks very different. And I think that's one of the things I've been most frustrated by in just these most recent debates is seeing people say, well, the average service job pays more than the average manufacturing job. That's true, but it's not a like-for-like comparison. The question is, let's talk about a worker without a college degree, what that person could earn in the manufacturing sector versus what kind of service job that person would likely to move into, or vice versa. And so if you do that comparison, what are the jobs available to those workers who have been, relatively speaking, left behind? The manufacturing jobs in that case are actually quite good ones. And David Autor and his colleagues, who are best known for their China shock research, just published an excellent paper a couple of months ago called People versus Places that really showed this in detail, that what happens when you deindustrialize is, yes, of course, other jobs replace the ones you lose. You can still be at full employment. But what you end up replacing it with is good jobs for a different set of workers and less good jobs for those workers who had been previously working in manufacturing. And so it's not that there's something inherently wonderful or, ennobling about manufacturing. It's that the jobs available in manufacturing in terms of who can take them, how productive they can be in them, where they are located outside of the sort of agglomerated coastal areas where we've seen so much of our growing prosperity, all of that happens to be things that you get from manufacturing jobs that we are not seeing in the services jobs that in a lot of cases replace them.
Kim, we're almost out of time here, but in the main, what are your main disagreements with Oren's thesis here?
I think this last comment kind of gets to the heart of the matter. If you are trying to think about whether you're going to improve the experience for a left behind region by levying a tariff, we can look at studies that have already been done on the first Trump administration's tariffs. And there have been several really careful studies that looked and asked these questions. Did it cause more manufacturing employment? Did it cause more production in key sectors? Did it help those left behind regions? And you see in study after study after study that the job loss associated with the supply chain disruption and the retaliation exceeded the job gains in these narrowly protected sectors. So I think looking to this policy tool to create anything other than disruption and regressivity is mistaken. I think we're going to see, and we're going to run this experiment, and we're going to see that production actually goes down for US manufacturing. Because imagine you were trying to site a plant somewhere in the world this year, and your choice is, I'm going to put it in the United States, where I don't know what's going on with the institutional strength, where I don't know what tariff rates will be tomorrow or 3 months from now or a year from now, where I don't know whether every country in the world will want to retaliate, where every part is going to be more expensive. Or I could site that plant somewhere else where I know I'm going to have free trade access to my parts, where I know I'm going to have a stable policy environment, where I know that the fiscal situation is under control. I don't think this willy-nilly tariff policy is going to get anywhere near the desired policy goals. I care about those goals too, and I respect Oren's genuine desire to address the left behind in this country. I just think this tool is going to make their lives much harder, not much better.
Oren, as a final comment, how would you respond to that? Because the other discrepancy that I think the markets have been worried about the most is that, if Trump stays the course on the current tariffs, there's going to be a lot of short-term pain, and we know what that is. But it doesn't seem like he will stay the course, or maybe, from signs we've been hearing, that he wants to use tariffs as a negotiating tool. And then you have a situation where there are too many carve-outs, and it begs the question whether it even accomplishes the longer-term goals that you've been enlisting here. So how do you square the uncertainty of it all with the broader sort of goals that you've been advocating for quite a while?
Well, I agree absolutely that the uncertainty has the potential to raise the costs dramatically and reduce the benefits, and that is that's a real problem. I agree with what Kim said, that a willy-nilly approach to the policy is not going to deliver the sorts of things that I'm focused on to a significant extent. And so, that's where I think as we started the conversation, my perspective is to sort of separate the tools in principle as can they be useful ones from a discussion of what's going on at this moment. And in my view, to say, yes, these are useful tools, but there probably is a pretty significant course correction needed if we're going to get the value that we could out of them.
And just on that, Oren, one last thing, because part of the issue here is, you're arguing for tariffs, but Trump has this strange understanding that all deficits are bad and arrived at this calculation of how other countries are tariffing the United States, which is simply not correct.
Well, I think to be clear, what they did was not say that this is how other countries are tariffing the United States. It was to say what we care about is the trade deficits with other countries. And therefore, when we say reciprocal tariff, what we mean is one that's proportional to those trade deficits, in part because we see the size of a deficit as something of a proxy for policies they probably have. Again, I think on the communication side, there has been much left wanting. I think the premise of saying where we see large imbalances that we do believe are actually driven by policy choices. I think countries like Korea, Japan, Germany, it's not a coincidence that they have the policy goal of running large trade surpluses and have achieved that. The question of what you do about it, can you bring them to the table? Reagan did it very successfully with the Japanese in the 1980s, but there's a lot to be done still in the execution if we are going to achieve anything like that here.
I know we're out of time. Oren Cass, Kimberly Clausing, thanks so much for joining us.
This was great. Thank you.
That's Oren Cass, the founder and chief economist of American Compass, a conservative economic think tank, and Kimberly Clausing, an economist and professor at UCLA. This debate aired on Foreign Policy Live, our weekly podcast hosted by FP Editor-in-Chief Ravi Agrawal. If you're not a regular listener, you should be. It's excellent. Counterpoint is a production of Foreign Policy in partnership with the Doha Forum. Our production staff includes Rob Sachs, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, and Dan Efron, with special thanks to Claudia Tatey. I'm Sasha Polako-Saransky. Thanks for listening.